The government has wasted time. On top of everything else, they are steering in the wrong direction. So we have a lost decade. Germany doesn't have so much of a demand problem. It's really a structure problem. And now we just need to get our act together and really to do reforms. It's not the case that the AfD has a lot to offer. The policies are really completely absurd. This would lead to a collapse of our economy.
Is Germany squandering its best shot to overcome the structural crisis that's facing its economy? Well, Clemens Fuest is president of the IFO Institute in Germany. He joins me now for more. Clemens, we wanted to have you on one more time as we close out this year. If we look at the past three, we've seen 2 years of recession and expected stagnation this year. Before we get into the political issues, are we seeing any positive signs in this economy as it's developing right now?
Not really, unfortunately. We are now at the level of GDP we had in 2019. So that is really overall 6 years of stagnation. What we see is that private investment, maybe the biggest challenge, private investment is declining. It's now back to the level of 2015. So we have a lost decade there. The only sector which is expanding is the public sector that increases its employment. Without the public sector expanding, we would have had a much stronger recession. The positive sign we see at the moment is that the government will spend a lot more next year, even more, and that will push the German economy to growth. At least that's what the forecasts say. So we'll return to growth. But the question is, how sustainable is that? Will this just be a short-term effect, or will this be really a more durable return to growth rates?
I want to go back to what you just said about public spending and investment. You recently gave a lecture and introduced a chart comparing these three things: economic output, public spending, and private investment. These are all indexes set to 2015, as you mentioned. We see everything more or less bunched up until about 2018. We know generally the German economy ran pretty well until then. The pandemic is a bit of an aberration. Why has everything split since then? To what extent is the rise in public spending a consequence or a cause of the drop in investment, for example?
It's certainly not a consequence of the fall in investment, but it's probably partly driving it. So what we've seen since 2018 is really difficulties of some key sectors in Germany, the automotive sector and increasingly also machinery. These were sectors that were very successful both within Germany and internationally, and now they are coming under increasing pressure, partly related to higher domestic costs and partly related to other countries becoming better, more innovative, in particular China. Then we had the energy crisis. Germany has always had a wobbly energy policy, very special and narrow energy policy, switching off its nuclear plants and so on. That has driven up energy prices. And then came the shock of Russia's attack on Ukraine and the end of the delivery of gas from Russia to Germany and Europe. And that has hit German industry very significantly. 15% of value added in manufacturing in Germany is energy intensive. So we have automotive, parts of the machinery industry, and the energy intensive industry. So it's three important sectors in crisis. And in the meantime, the public sector has been expanding because the government has increased debt and has just increased spending without regard to the general economic situation.
Going to that point, this was supposed to be a period of reforms that could help business conditions for social spending, for energy prices, for bureaucracy. Right now, the government is bogged down in a debate over pensions. To what extent has it wasted time?
It looks like it has wasted time. It started out with a mix of measures, and some were directed towards getting the economy back to growth, like accelerated depreciation generally for investment. That was a good idea. The perspective that the corporate tax will be reduced as from 2028. So those were two steps in the right direction. But apart from that, not much has happened, and a lot of money has been spent on interest groups like the restaurants, the cut in the value-added tax for restaurants, and questionable ideas like tax breaks for overtime work. The problem here in Germany is not that we don't have enough overtime work. The issue is we have a lot of part-time work. So the government has really lost time to some extent. And now, on top of everything else, they are steering in the wrong direction because they are massively increasing pensions and putting a huge burden on future budgets. A budget that hasn't even digested the increased spending on the military, which is debt finance at the moment, but cannot remain so forever. So there really is a big challenge here.
In this debate about pensions, I've heard the argument that more generous pension payments also generates economic activity as pensioners spend. You could say the same thing maybe about some of these other tax breaks and incentives. Is that not a fair point when you're looking for economic activity right now?
No, our problem is not a lack of domestic consumption demand. So our wages have been rising relatively steadily, and incomes of pensioners have been rising quite well. So this is not really the issue. Inflation is between 2 and 3%. So Germany doesn't have so much of a demand problem. It's really a structural problem. So we need structural reforms. And we need improved incentives to work. So what we're doing here is reduce incentives to work because taxes will rise as a consequence of these pension decisions. It's clearly the wrong way.
To what extent does the situation in Germany mirror that of France to some extent, where you also see a debate about social spending and debt spending? As an economist, let me back up and say that we see from other economists too a similar assessment that the money set aside from the German government should be spent for larger investments that then springboards private spending later. As an economist looking at this, do you just sort of have to say that's not going to happen for the sake of some sort of political stability because these debates are so escalating all the time that it's just sort of outside of your realm in some way?
So what we see in Germany is that the debt earmarked for investment is, at least to a large extent, maybe half, not going to investment. So it's used for other things. Does that make sense to maintain political stability? And maybe it does in the short term, but it certainly doesn't in the long term because the budget problems get worse. And maybe there are lessons to learn from France. Now, France looks like it's having a completely dysfunctional government because the political parties in the parliament cannot agree, apparently, on any reform that will reduce the budget deficit, although everybody knows they urgently do need to reduce that deficit. But it's very hard to agree on these things. Of course, it's always easier to solve distributional conflicts by postponing them to the future, but then they get worse. So putting money on it, borrowed money, and that's what happened in France. And France is now really in a critical situation. Interest rates on French debt are rising, and Germany is fiscally still in a much better position, but it's moving into the direction of France. So the inability to rein in spending at times where it is completely crystal clear that we do need to rein in spending because we have this buildup in military spending, entirely debt financed. So this is not sustainable.
Your institute makes regular assessments of business sentiment. How would you describe the mood amongst businesses right now in Germany?
So what we've seen over the last years is that the mood, that sentiment was slowly getting worse. It wasn't collapsing, but businesses, sentiment slowly declined. That's compatible with this stagnation situation we had. And this year, when we ask companies how their current situation is, this has stabilized maybe, but not increased. But we also ask them, what are your expectations for the future? And that has brightened a little bit because companies expect that the government will spend more money next year and that they will somehow benefit from it. But the increase has been very slow. And what we are not seeing yet is really a turnaround in business sentiment. Also with regard to the current situation, that's what we would need to say, okay, we are out of the doldrums here.
Speaking of businesses and business sentiment, I'm curious what you make of the debate among German businesses and industry groups right now over their willingness to be in dialogue with the far-right populist AfD party, a party that has surged in the polls in recent years, but has, of course, been sort of walled off as a kind of firewall from the political mainstream. Now it seems to be pulling in more businesses, or at least business seems to be pulled more into this debate. How do you look at that?
I think what's important is really to look at what the AfD is proposing in terms of economic policies. And if we take a look at that, we see that part of its economic program is really completely absurd. For instance, one of the points they are suggesting is let's increase pension payments from 48 to 70% of gross wages. That's clearly impossible, but it's a typical populist proposal. It cannot be financed, but it has appealed to certain groups of the population. So it would be important to discuss these things and to say it's not the case that the AfD has a lot to offer to overcome the economic situation, the economic issues. They are anti-immigration. They even want people who have immigrated to Germany in the past to leave. This would lead to a collapse of our economy because 1/3 of the population has, some kind of migration background. So a lot of the policies are really completely absurd. But by saying we don't even discuss these things, people don't notice. People just see that the established parties fail to address the issues that need to be addressed. And so this myth comes up that the AfD does things better. In my view, they would do all of these things a lot worse even. So, but this can only be understood if we have a dialogue, if we include what they say in the general dialogue. Quite another question is, do you want to invite these people and give them the opportunity to, disseminate their messages? That's a different question.
So more dialogue, but whether they should be invited to these kind of political evenings that many of these industry groups have, where do you stand on that?
I'm no specialist on political communication, and this is a free country. So I think every industry association has to decide on their own. But saying nobody from this political party can ever be invited is, of course, an extreme position. And a lot of voters of the AfD voters then get the impression they have, that the AfD people have very good ideas, but that the political establishment doesn't want to hear them. And that's not true. They have no good ideas. And I think that should be out in the open.
One last question on this issue. Could it be seen as a sign of frustration, excuse me, that some industry groups do want to have this kind of involvement more with the AfD, or that they are interested in reaching out, a sign during a period in which there aren't any reforms taking place, maybe as a signal to the government?
It does reflect frustration. There's no doubt about that. The frustration is about the fact that if we look at the moderate political parties, in the current political situation with almost a quarter of the voters voting AfD and then some on the extreme left, the governments we are still able to form are basically always the same. So we have variants of the same. And these parties are very reluctant to enact political reforms where some political energy is needed, where distributional conflicts have to be addressed. So a lot of business leaders are frustrated because they are used to addressing issues that come up in their companies and to act quickly, and they are frustrated. So they are looking, maybe some of them are looking for something else, but I think most of them, and I'm sure most of them understand that the AfD is probably not the solution.
Clemens, before we let you go, we have to ask you, what makes you optimistic about the German economy looking ahead?
What makes me optimistic is that we have options for reforms. We can solve our problems by ourselves. We can do more to cooperate in Europe. We can deepen the European common markets. We can change our labor laws. We can position ourselves in the world as a place where democracy is relatively secure, where the rule of law is secure. I think these are all opportunities. Currently, a lot of scientists are skeptical about the US as a place for their future. We should grasp this opportunity and attract them to Europe. So I think we do have opportunities. We have room to act, and now we just need to get our act together and really to do reforms. I'm still optimistic that we can achieve that.